Good morning, everybody. Or sorry, good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Jennings and I'm Chairman of Movers and Shakers, and I'm delighted to see so many of you on today's seminar, including members of our public and private sector community and guests from around the UK. Now, for those of you who've not heard about Movers and Shakers before, shame on you. We've been organising events for over 25 years, bringing together key players from both public and private sectors, creating best-in-class forums, conferences and networking right across the UK. Now, we've recently developed and launched our state-of-the-art public and private sector community platform to enable our members to make new contacts, arrange meetings, share knowledge and showcase their organisations. And our mission for 2021 is to promote public and private sector collaboration. And today's event is a good example of what we're delivering. So if you're interested in being part of this initiative, please join us. It's really gathering momentum. We're planning to launch our live physical events across the UK back in September. So please watch this space and we'll keep you posted on developments. Today's event is in fact a collaboration between ourselves and the High Streets Task Force, and our second event in this series. Now, the High Street Task Force was commissioned by the government in 2019 as part of the plan for the High Street. Its aim is to facilitate and support local authorities in regenerating their high streets and town centres. Underpinned by 830 million from the Future High Streets Fund that will be invested in 72 areas across England, add in the Towns Fund and the Levelling Up agenda, and you get to approximately £8 billion of funding. But is it enough, I hear you ask? Well, you'll find out later. Today's event is supported by Leslie Jones Architecture, who have to be one of the most experienced firms of architects in the design of town and city centres and in the development of the modern shopping centre. In more recent times, the firm, now part of RSBG UK, has returned to its roots in regeneration and is now very much at the forefront of urban renewal. Now, with collaboration at the heart of its agenda, Leslie Jones has co-founded Urban Kind, a consultancy entirely focused on the regeneration of both public and private sectors. They are doing some really interesting stuff around physical and digital relationships, experiences and branding. Now, without stealing the thunder of our contributors, there is little doubt that the High Street, aka city and town centres, are crying out for investment and transformation. This is a massive and also a challenging opportunity, but one that can genuinely deliver enormous benefits to communities, to businesses, and can provide a platform for urban growth and underpin the Levelling Up agenda and a massive investment opportunity. So we've got a fantastic group of contributors today. Lord Bob Kerslake, Chairman of the UK 2070 Commission, among many other things, which I'll come on to. Rebecca Guzman-Bedell, Head of Retail Strategy at the Chelsfield Group. Shamik Naratam, Managing Director of Morgan Stanley Real Assets. Bruce Findlay, Managing Director, Retail Shopping Centres and Retail Parks Portfolio Management at Landsec. Nicola Free, Managing Director, Head of Real Estate Finance at EMEA HSBC Bank. James Cons, Managing Director of Leslie Jones Architecture. And last but not least, Mark Robinson, Chair of the High Streets Task Force, co-founder of Alandai, a leading shopping centre investment manager. So quickly, let me explain how things are going to work this morning. We're going to kick things off with a keynote by Lord Kerslake, who's going to talk about the importance of the Levelling Up agenda and town centres, followed by an interview with Mark Robinson. James Cons is then going to make a presentation on integrated placemaking, and then we have our panel session, the High Street, a £250 billion investment opportunity. Now, importantly, please remember you can ask questions, you can make comments and observations by using the live discussions tab on the platform. Now, we got a lot of interaction at the last event, so please get involved. This is a great opportunity and we've got together a great group of people who should be able to answer or comment on most of your questions. Back to Lord Kerslake. Lord Kerslake has by any measure had an extraordinary career. I think I met him, it was probably 10 years ago when he headed up the HCA, now Homes England. He was previously Chief Exec of Hounslow, Chief Exec of Sheffield. He was Permanent Secretary to DCLG. He was Head of the Civil Service. His current roles include Chair of Stockport MDC, Chair of Peabody Trust, Chair of Be First, Barking and Dagenham's Housing Delivery Company. So a very warm welcome to Lord Kerslake. Thank you for joining us. I know you have a very busy diary, Lord Kerslake, so welcome to the platform.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, David, and thank you to Movers and Shakers and High Streets Task Force for inviting me to speak to you. As David said, I want to cover two things, really. First of all, the agenda of rebalancing the UK economy, or levelling up as it's now called, and then the link between that and the agenda around our high streets. I've been chair of the UK 2070 Commission for over 3 years now. It's an independent commission that's looked at the issue of spatial inequalities in the UK. And it's called 2070 because we've gone back 50 years and forward 50 years, because we believe these are long game issues. We did a first report which looked at, to what extent are we unequal in the UK? And what we found that actually we are almost the most spatially unequal country in the developed world. On a basket of 28 indicators, the UK came 28th out of 30 countries in terms of its inequalities. That's sort of Eurovision Song Contest levels of performance. So we clearly have a challenge in this country that is also, in a sense, moving in the wrong direction. Our third report, which I thought might be our final report, looked at what we might do about this. And we came up with a 10-point action plan that looked across the range of issues that we need to tackle: infrastructure, skills, local economy, housing, research excellence, and so on. And what we found really was that you need to act on a wide range of fronts in order to make an impact on this very entrenched inequality that we have in the United Kingdom. Now, between our first and third report, we had a new government that were committed to levelling up, what we called rebalancing. We welcome that, actually, as a commission, because it showed and signalled an interest in this key agenda. But what we said was that in order to make this really do something, you needed to have a comprehensive, long-term, wide-ranging plan. It needed to be of scale, and there needed to be clear leadership in government over time. And I think so far what we've seen is some interesting and valuable initiatives, but not yet that clear long-term plan that's going to make a difference. I thought when we produced that report, that would be the end of our reports. But in fact, of course, very soon after we published it, the pandemic struck. And we wanted to look at exactly how the pandemic had impacted on the levelling up or rebalancing agenda. What we found was that the agenda had become harder, undoubtedly harder, but also more urgent, definitely more urgent. And we felt very strongly that it needed to happen locally, if at all possible. Local leadership and local focus on the economy was absolutely vital. 2 points to make here. This isn't a North v South agenda. I chair Peabody and chair Be First. We've got big issues in places like London as well as outside London, but there is a specific need to raise productivity and wealth outside of London and the Southeast. Second point is we shouldn't see this as towns v cities. We need our cities to perform well, and we need our towns to perform well as well. And they work together in what are often called city systems, or city regions, if you like. So let me move on then to the issue of town centres and high streets. I think we need to be honest here that the retail centres of high streets have been declining now since the turn of the century. And of course we know why: out-of-town shopping and online shopping. In fact, since 2010, nearly 1,400 retailers have entered administration. So we can't deny the reality of that. And there's been quite a few reviews that have looked at it. In truth, none have significantly altered that retail trend. And indeed, if we look now at the impact of the pandemic, it has undoubtedly accelerated it. And you only have to visit, as I did recently, some of our town or city centres. I went to Hull last week, and you can see the impact in terms of shops that have closed down and likely ever to open again in their current form. Does that make me pessimistic about the future of town centres? No, it doesn't. And for this reason, really, I think we need now to see town centres as an economic opportunity, not simply about having a conversation about the declining retail offer. Town centres have always been about more than retail. We now need to think of them as a mix of workspace, culture, education, leisure, the civic role, and of course, housing. We need to think of them in that comprehensive way as economic opportunities. And what we find from the surveys post-COVID is that people want to come together again. They do want to meet outdoor. Indeed, it's the highest thing that they've said they miss, if you like. And town centres can be those meeting places for work, for leisure, for entertainment. And that's where I think we need to focus our effort. And by the way, I think that could also restore the individual character of our town centres, which I think have often now been seen as quite common with very little difference. Perhaps a certain level of blandness has crept in. How are we going to do this reinvention? Well, as I said earlier, local authorities take the lead. They absolutely have to. They have to be the curators, if you like, of our town centres, looking at that mix that I've spoken about. They have to be the leaders in the partnership agenda, working between public and private sector, and indeed with the voluntary and community sector and the education sector as well. They need to try things out, have the permission to experiment and the permission to fail. They also need to be the anchors and the facilitators of new investment. It won't all be public investment, but they can help and encourage that investment to happen. And crucially, they need to take the lead in developing radical new transformational plans for the future of their town centres. Let me just give you two quick examples of how I'm personally involved in this agenda. First of all, Be First, I think a terrific initiative by Barking and Dagenham that allows us to both grow jobs and housing in Barking and Dagenham and create a surplus that can be reinvested back into the council. We're focused on two centres really, one being Barking Town Centre, the other being Heathway. Barking Town Centre in an area that has quite a high level of deprivation, but has still retained a strong retail offer, partly because it wasn't an area where a lot of chains came in. We've now got a regeneration plan, and we're looking at creative ideas such as a food hall and alternative uses of those things that are available, such as the shopping centre. Heathway, we bought the centre in Heathway in Dagenham, and we're now focused on reinventing how that particular retail centre works and how we use the space that we have available to us. A second one in the north, I chair the first town-based mayoral development corporation set up by Andy Burnham in Stockport MDC. We're in fact responsible for an area on the one side of the town centre in Stockport, but we want to create 3,500 new homes as well as a new destination. And by doing that, I think we'll inject new life into Stockport Town Centre, which already a lot has happened to improve. And we've set ourselves the ambition of being the cleanest, greenest, coolest neighbourhood. Now, the quality of the public realm is really important, but it's not sufficient. Simply focusing on the public realm is not enough, and simply focusing on short-term investment, as I fear some of the funds that are now being created, is not enough either. I would be testing whether those investments are part of a wider plan to deliver economic growth and regeneration and diversify the uses within town centres. What else should the government be doing? I think some radical changes around taxation are needed. I would move for an online sales tax, and I would reinvest that money back into local places in order to help them. And I think we need a complete overhaul of business rates, which is both unfair and, in my view, a barrier to development. I think permitted development rights is a major challenge as well, because it involves the loss of control for local leadership in what they do in their town centres. And I think the government as a whole need to be clearer and more ambitious in what they do on levelling up, as well as what they do in town centres. And I note with interest that the Labour Party is setting up its own review to come out with new ideas. So more needed from government, but a lot of the leadership coming locally. Do we have a challenge from COVID? We certainly do. The Centre for Cities found that the same challenges that we have in terms of employment and economic development are now going to be 4 to 10 times harder than they were pre-COVID. Is this mission impossible? With good leadership from the public and private sector, I don't believe it is, but we have to be prepared to invest, prepared to take risks, work collaboratively, and think about a reinvented future for our town centres. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Kerslake. Absolutely fascinating. Now, your ears must burn frequently because I'm often quoting you. And one of the quotes I often use is, you've likened the levelling up agenda to the reunification of Germany. And that cost 1.3 trillion euros. Now, David sketched out that the government interventions are currently penciled in for about 8 billion, which leaves us short 1,292 billion. Crikey, all these numbers, they all blur into one. So where is this money going to come from? We've got a panel who've got access to tens of billions. How are we going to get them excited in this agenda?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mark. And I'd say a number of things quickly on that, because I know time is tight. The key thing about West and East Germany is that if you remember when they came together, East Germany was clearly very well behind on its economic position. But what we have in the UK are some bits of our country that are where East Germany was before reunification. That was the point we found as far as GDP was concerned. And it just brought home the scale of the challenge. And yes, they put a lot of investment into infrastructure and other things. Not all of it well spent, but quite a lot has made an impact. What I'd say to you is, though, we do need to spend more in this country. We spend perhaps 1.2% of our GDP on infrastructure. Other countries are up at 3, 4, and even 5%. So actually, it's going to need more investment. And I think more of that investment will need to go to places outside London and the Southeast. And it needs to be sustained for a long period of time. I think the money's there. And actually, I think what it will do is, if we get it right, we will grow the economy, and that in turn will bring receipts back into government to replenish the investments they've made. So I think that it's perfectly possible to find the resources for this. And what that will do, as it is doing in Barking and Dagenham and in Stockport, will act as a can opener, a lever for the private sector to say, public sector is putting its money where its mouth is, we'll come alongside that. And that's precisely how things happened in Sheffield. I think it's perfectly doable, but people will look to see whether or not government is playing its part in this. And I think there's scope to spend more, and certainly spend more outside of London and the Southeast.
There was a very timely announcement this morning that lately of this parish, Chris Grigg, has been announced as the new head of the Infrastructure Bank. I assume that's an initiative that would you find support with you?
Completely support the Infrastructure Bank, completely support any new options for investment finance that we can establish. All of that is very welcome, actually. But all my experience of the private sector, and indeed public-private partnerships like this, is they need to know that the place that they're going to is well led and has a clear plan. Put it crudely, people won't jump if they're not sure the floorboards are sound. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely. And the High Street Task Force is about building that capacity and having a plan in place. But without that clear leadership, there isn't that rallying point and that rallying call, or even that person to go to make things happen. I see that in my day job, and that's something we need to encourage. Without wishing to get overly political, it does occur to me that politicians repeatedly talk a very good game about devolution, levelling up, empowerment of local places. But once they get their hands on those levers of power, they're loath to let it go. So what is the structural problem about this empowerment?
Oh gosh, how long have you got, Mark? I mean, this is a
about
mission.
2.5 minutes.
Ha! Okay. Well, look, nothing ever changes until it does. Let's see what the white paper brings. Let's see if we move it forward from that. But I think at the core of the issue is parity of esteem. Central government needs to recognise that local government, local leadership, at its best, delivers really powerful things that they cannot do. They don't have the capacity or the knowledge or the skills. And if they want good outcomes locally, they need to trust local leadership. And it's not going to be one move, it's going to be a series of moves towards more power, more resources led at local level. I do think it's possible. It's possible with any government, but you just have to work very hard against the ingrained small c conservatism that exists both amongst politicians and the civil service. And what I would love to see is a new champion in government, like Osborne was with the Northern Powerhouse, willing to put their neck on the line and drive it forward inside government. That would be fantastic. We lack that at the moment.
I've been through 3 high street ministers in 7 months. I'm not taking it personally, but I think obviously, you know, having a little bit more permanence in some of our public appointments would help the agenda, surely.
Absolutely. But then you see that in local government. Again, I've been involved in Greater Grimsby. You know, there's been changes at the political level, but the chief exec of North East Links has been there for a good while. And all the things he's been working for has suddenly come to a head, really, with new funding, levelling up, all sorts of things coming through from government that I think for the first time in a way for Grimsby might just add up to the combination that will make a difference. And so there's both a huge excitement at the opportunity, but a big responsibility to make it happen. And he's been there for a good while, and I think he will make that continuity can be there at local government that sometimes defeats central government.
So a final question to look at it from look at the relationship between central and local government in a different way. So prior to your preeminent role in the civil service and running DCLG or MHCLG as it is now, you were a local leader at Sheffield and at Hounslow. So what advice, and we've got a lot of people in the audience today who have got similar positions. So what advice would you give to your younger self about how to get the best out of MHCLG as a local leader?
God, that is a tough question. How do I answer that? I think engage, first of all, with both ministers and civil servants, actively engage, show and tell. So show them what you've achieved, get them out to see what you've done. I pretty much pressurize my top middle managers to get out once a week, really. Didn't always like it, but they did it, and they always came back being positive and impressed with what they saw. I think thirdly, being able to tell people the story, the narrative of what you're doing, so they can get a sense of an evidence-based plan is crucially important in the agenda. And don't look for it simply government to give you the money. Make it very clear what you're bringing to the party. Stockport Council, in a sense, allowing 100 million borrowing through the MDC to promote, kickstart the process. So they're putting their money where the mouth is. Now we need, in a sense, the national agencies to come alongside that and the private sector to come alongside it. It is about taking the lead, putting your money where your mouth is, demonstrating what you are capable of achieving. That's what impresses civil servants and ministers in government, really.
Fantastic. I would love to talk to you for hours about this topic, and maybe we can follow up some other time, but I'm well aware that you've got some other interview.
Right, I'm doing some interviews, but look, great luck. Good luck with the event, really. Great event to be having.
Okay, fantastic. David.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you, Lord Kerslake, for your time. I know how busy you are. And I think, Mark, that's really sort of, if you like, it sets out what Lord Kerslake shared with us and what you discussed together really sets out the challenge, doesn't it? And the importance of the challenge and the importance of this levelling up agenda and the parts of the high streets in that process. And indeed, the scale and the challenge, if you like, of the scale of the opportunity. Now, I'd like to welcome James Cons, who's Managing Director of Leslie Jones Partnerships, to the platform. He's going to make a presentation to us, integrated placemaking, a step-by-step approach to a new urban kind. And if you like, perhaps a look at a route to actually driving forward the regeneration of our town centres. Over to you, James. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Just share my screen. So when I joined this group this morning, Mark kindly asked me, was I actually an architect? And I answered to him, yes, I am. I am absolutely an architect, but I'm also someone who's massively passionate about our towns and city centres and trying to tackle the challenges that are ahead of us in the coming years. And what I want to talk about today really is integrated placemaking, a step-by-step approach to a new urban kind. We've talked about that. Lord Kerslake's talked about this. Our town and city centres are in a state of shock. Their decline has been well documented, which now hastened by the onset of COVID, is posing significant challenges for those invested financially, socially, and emotionally. We need a different approach to resolving the issues that we're facing. And what is that approach? We believe it's about integration. It's about integrated placemaking. It's about bringing the right skills together in the same place to deliver critical and creative thinking that's going to challenge the normal ways or the old ways that we tackled regeneration of the past. So, setting the scene, competition between towns and cities has accelerated, leaving less successful towns and cities behind, risking permanent decline. Such speedy change is challenging the ability of our infrastructure, built environment, policies, occupational models to keep up. Town centres and their stakeholders must find ways to react to this change in the short and medium term so that the long-term strategies might be informed. Those that succeed in rapidly redefining their relevance to their changing world will thrive. Consequently, those that don't, won't. So change brings opportunity. With the old model broken, a different methodology is now clearly needed. We need to be open to these changes. We need to be open to these opportunities that are brought through the need for change. The cookie cutter approach is finally banished to the kitchen drawer, with tailored regional appropriate responses now required. Success lies in an inherent understanding of the place, the specific relationships between people, communities, and their town centre or high street. In the past, I've worked in Banbury, I've worked in Birkenhead. The GODE maps for Banbury and Birkenhead were pretty much similar, but they are completely different places. They are completely different cultures, and they need completely different solutions. And now's the time to start serving up those different solutions by critically understanding what these places actually need. So opportunity brings purpose to seek new models, relationships, and ways of working toward a central vision. New purpose needs to be injected into our urban centres, which is relevant to the communities they serve. New entities, partnerships, and ways of working need to come to the fore, galvanised around, and this is critical, a distinct vision of place, whether this be a city, town centre, or high street. New operational models need to be thought about. It's about events rather than rents. New ownership models. Town centre investment zones have been talked about for many years. How do we pool our assets together in places where there are disparate ownerships so that everybody can benefit? The community, the landlords, those that occupy the spaces can benefit from this investment as the money flows in. A new vision, incremental and investable. Gone are the grand projects of the past. In their place, we believe a new vision for repair needs to be built. One that is human-centric, not led by an investment model per se, incremental, building over time, small splashes, not big splashes. Don't lob the rock into the middle of the pond, skim a stone, see where it lands before you take a dip. Adaptable, constantly evolving and learning. Allow 5% to fail. Create test beds to understand what your communities really are going to support. And when they support it with their time, they'll support it with their money, and that will give you proof that you can invest, you can bring those ideas, those thoughts into the permanent place. Investable, understand what prosperity means for everybody involved, for the landowners, for those that want to come to the place, and for those that operate within the place. Understand that there are social and economic benefits. There are new value metrics around economy, environment, and social well-being, and we need to really understand that. And critically, you need to build it on an inherent understanding of the place and its community. You need to be led by the data. You need to go into these places and ask the right questions. So we need to provide a different approach to placemaking for stakeholders whose futures are inextricably linked to the urban success of the places that they're vested in. So integrating placemaking, addressing the hollowing out of our town centres, which traditionally provide the focus of our communities, offering insight backed by data involving economic, social, cultural, digital and placemaking strategies, gathered around a central vision, creating solutions ranging from digital interventions to physical activation and event-based engagement with the local community, through to cultural, digital, economic and physical master plans. We need to find a new urban kind, one that brings the correct skills in a joined up manner, to bring the appropriate skills and those experiences critically into an integrated approach, one that isn't siloed in the past where reports were handed on to the next consultant who would then interpret it, who would then try and work out what it means, would then apply it, and through a course of Chinese whispers, the whole dialogue would break down. We need to bring this into a central place. So what might that process look like? As I've said before, research and insight is at the heart of this. You need to understand, critically understand the places that you are going to be involved in. You can't take the old approach, which is the cookie cutter, the same investment model being repeated again and again and again and again. We need to get into the place, understand its people. You need to look at insight and trends and generational trends. You need to work out the demographics of your place, understand what's coming down the line. The kids of today will be the spenders of the future. You need to plan for that as you understand that and critically analyze that so that you can drive forward into an experience mapping process. That might register the past, it might look at the present, but it definitely needs to predict the future so that you have a plan, you have a route map that drives forward into a vision. And that vision isn't a grand vision, it's not a grand projet of the past. It is a vision, it is a route map, it is a pathway that you need to take the journey on. And you need to underpin that with a brand proposition and the right governance and control. And if you think about it, brands make a promise. And when brands deliver on that promise, they build loyalty from their customer base. And when they build loyalty, they build confidence. People are confident that they will be delivered what they've asked for from the brand that is delivering it. And if you apply that to a place and you think about brand architecture techniques, I think it's massively relevant. And that will drop down into strategies, strategies around activation, strategies around digital, physical strategies, business planning and governance frameworks, linking those together with the appropriate skills in one place. Digital, we talk about digital a lot, but I work with one local authority and this local authority, we looked at their app together and their app started with report it and refuse management. And it wasn't until you got to the last page did you find something that said things to do. Well, I'm a member of the Highline app in New York. It's a really rich digital engagement for a physical place. You know what's going on. It enriches your life. You can see what you want to invest your time in and engage with it. You can talk over the app. You can see the programs and things that you might want to visit and what those timings are. So it augments the physical strategy. And then likewise, the physical strategy needs to augment the digital strategy. So we need to find ways of fixing these places. We're working in one city where one particular street under fractured ownership, council are putting a lot of money around public realm. We've come up with a strategy for shopfront as mentoring support for the tenants. And we're looking at a digital platform for this singular place within a city to actually gather these independent retailers and operators into one place to give them a large voice. And I think that type of nuanced and targeted work with individual places and spaces within towns and cities is vital, as is the business plan that goes alongside that. You need to know what the returns are. You need to know how you're going to work with that, and critically, how you're going to manage and control it. And then that pulls down into implementation. So incremental implementation, short-term, medium, and long-term, all feeding in and taking the journey on the vision. In the short term, your test bed state, working with meanwhile and digital interventions. They're low cost in investment terms, but they can give high impact returns. You can test what will work with your community. You can bring that forward, and as you move into the medium term phase, you can start pushing that into the physical space, whether that be in the space between the buildings, i.e. the public realm, or selected buildings and partners that you've worked with along the way to actually start implementing some of these strategies until you actually hit the long term, where you're talking about larger scale redevelopment and investments with wholesale change, large developments of residential, office, mixed use schemes that follow in after you've done all the good work before. So those large projects of the past, those grand projets that sort of landed from space into our towns and city centres, generally anchored by a John Lewis anchor store, those days are gone. We're now in much more nuanced space. So we're working with Grimsby, Lord Kerslake mentioned, with their Future High Streets Fund bid, which is about public realm. It's about gathering new spaces and places and putting new occupation and investing into that town centre. We've done the same with Winsford, a small town where those interventions are going to mean a huge amount to the communities that they serve. So we think that actually the future is bright. We share Lord Kerslake's view that there is something to cherish, there is something to move forward on. We think it's something to do with integrating the right skills and in the right space at the right time to create really creative and critical placemaking strategies, because we need to celebrate the diversity of our places that make up our towns and city centres. So thank you for listening to me. I've been James Collins.
A really fascinating presentation, and so a couple of points resonated with me was around the sort of this whole integrated approach, and the other point was about differentiation. There's some interesting books, isn't there, on social change and how our high streets change and how all the big brands came in and led to many towns being replicas of other towns, and no reason for going to different places because they didn't deliver anything different to you. So great shared vision, and also fascinated by the digital strategy piece. But a couple of questions for you. First one is, in this whole process, and Lord Kerslake picked up on it, how, for you as somebody who has to sort of, if you like, orchestrate this strategy, how important is civic leadership?
It is central, absolutely central to this, because I look at the local authority as the glue that holds the place together, and they control. Local authorities control the space between the buildings, and that's a really good place to start. We're just putting a bid together at the moment, which is absolutely that. It's around the space between the buildings, and then local authorities own buildings. The repurposing of those structures. So when you add it together, you say, well, actually, what does your estate look like, and what can we do with that estate to implement significant change? So the leadership of the local authority, the leadership of the officers and politicians within a town or city centre is absolutely vital, and their ability to understand that where they lead from an investment point of view, others will follow. They just need to make sure the impacts are the right impacts that will attract the private sector money and investment.
Okay, and a second, just a comment really, I suppose. It just seems to me, in listening to all that, this is all about the communities taking back the high street, isn't it? I mean, since it's failed them for a number of years. Yeah, well, I think,
again, Lord Kerslake mentioned the sort of clone town, and I've mentioned it, where the investment model, the growth of retail, the attractiveness of that in terms of investment model, has pushed all of the sort of regionally and locally distinct uses to the edge of the city centre as it was filled with good retail. I've spent years delivering that. That's we work to a certain method, but that's now gone, and I think the opportunity is now here to enable those things to flood back into the city and town centres that were once marginalised into the cheaper space, and actually you can bring those together. We can get critical mass of regionally differentiated and relevant to those communities into one space, and that starts to build that plurality of why you're coming to the town. Lots of different reasons. We've worked on schemes with future cities, on cultural master planning, before you actually even come into the place, you just need to understand what's going to make it tick.
Listen, we've run out of time, sadly, because I think the comment was made earlier. We can go on all day about this. There's so much to discuss. James, thank you very much for that. That's really very, very helpful. And thank you very much for your support with these sessions. Right, we're now going to open up our panel session. So investing in the high street, Mark, a £250 billion opportunity. Welcome to Rebecca, to Shamik, to Bruce, to Nicola, and of course to Mark himself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David and James, and thanks once again to James and Leslie Jones for their sponsorship of these events. Now, today, once again, we have a stellar panel whose experience is as broad as its knowledge is deep. And we're going to see if we can answer this question about whether it is a £250 billion opportunity for investment and lending. So taking each panelist in turn. So we've got Shamik Narottam, who is Managing Director of Morgan Stanley Private Equity Real Estate. Morgan Stanley are a global behemoth when it comes to investment through their private equity funds. Shamik leads a team who have tens of billions of pounds that they could choose to invest or not choose to invest in our town centre. So that's what we'll be investigating. But we are talking about levelling up. We're talking about building back better. And Shamik, you were a structural engineer. We need more structural engineers. So what went wrong?
Oh, well, you mean what went right?
I don't know.
Look, I'm a structural engineering fan at heart. I suppose what I'm doing now is helping fund future structural engineering projects. It's all part of the chain.
Fantastic. Next, on to Nicola Free, who is our financier, our banker. Now, Nicola's got a huge amount of experience working at great institutions such as Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, and Rothschilds with my business partner, Morgan Garfield, a little while ago. She's now head of real estate at HSBC EMEA, so has a European and more global view of what's going on. And much like Shamik, you started your career in a different way, and I can't suggest for a second that the world needs more lawyers, but why did you change from being a lawyer to working in real estate finance?
Yeah, look, great question. It wasn't something I probably intended to move from so quickly, but again, the beauty of networking and a sort of love of real estate, I managed to get the opportunity to help set up a CMBS platform back in the early 2000s. So jumped at the opportunity and have never looked back since.
Fantastic. It certainly is the right industry for networking, and I'm looking forward to being able to network with everybody in a little bit more of a social way shortly. Now, in terms of career changes, this is the mother of all career changes I'm about to introduce here. So we're joined by Bruce Findlay, who joined Landsec at the end of last year and is their managing director in charge of retail. Before that, he had a pretty impressive career working at some of the world's leading brands. So he was an occupier, working with Diesel, Furler, M&S, Calvin Klein. Now, when we spoke earlier, you said it's, people have described it as you being poacher turned gamekeeper, but given what's going on in retail property, it strikes me you're more like with respect, you're more like a rodent who's been sat in northern Italy with a fantastic job, who's decided to cover himself in kerosene and then run up the gangplank onto a boat that's well ablaze. So what's this career change all about? Why now?
Well, at the end of the day, at the heart of, but whether whichever side of the fence you're on, consumers, shoppers are at the heart of what we do. And so in that sense, there's a great deal of synergy in making that change from poacher to gamekeeper.
Fantastic. Clearly a man who loves a challenge. Now, Rebecca Guzman-Vidal is head of group's retail strategy at Chelsfield. I've shared a number of panels with you in the past, and we agree with many, many things. And we've actually got two things in common. Firstly, you used to work at CBRE Retail, which I never have, but I did work at Dalgleish, and Dalgleish and CBR Retail are much the same thing. I think you and I will agree.
Indeed.
The second thing we both have in common is a passion and interest in brain care, and I don't mind plugging this. So do you want to talk our fellow panelists through our mutual interest?
Sure. We both Mark and I invested in a business called Heights, who do brain care vitamins, which I think we both take religiously and have done so for the past year or so. And it's obviously made us way cleverer and way more intelligent than we were before. So it's great. I highly recommend
the
it.
caliber of chat between you and I might be elevated beyond the other panelists as a result of our brain care supplement.
That's shameless plug there.
It is a shameless.
Shameless.
If I could control the messages on the slide, I'd put the link to the brand, but I can't, unfortunately. Okay, fantastic. So we've got two things going on here. We've got James, who said that the future is bright, and I firmly believe that. But at the same time, I was discussing with Lord Kerslake this £1.2 billion funding gap. You know, between you guys, you control tens of billions of pounds of funds and billions of pounds of real estate. What's holding us back from making those changes, and what can we do as an industry to turn this into the opportunity that we all believe in? So let's start with a positive. You know, what's investable within our town centres at the moment? So Shamik, I know you always follow the beat of your own drum when it comes to investing, and I know you have been looking at some retail assets. So what's your current view of what's investable?
Oh dear. Well, look, it's not easy, I think, as an initial qualifier, right? I mean, certainly what's popular, I suppose, at the moment in commercial real estate is, well, beds, sheds, and meds, and I think not much sheds or meds in most town centres. So really, we're talking about residential is the flavour of the month, of the year. Now, I think in terms of the retail component, we are looking, I think finally, I mean, our last retail investment we did close to 10 years ago in the UK. I mean, we have done in Europe quite a lot. And so, you know, finally, we're starting to really look as prices have, I suppose, reset to where we thought they should have reset a long time ago. But it's not an easy picture.
Rebecca, is that a view you share? We spoke about this yesterday about pricing and where you feel it may need to get to be of interest.
I do. I agree. There's a definite sense that retail is not flavour of the month. And for those investors that are looking at it, I mean, in our experience, working with some of our Asian investors, it's very much a case of, can you create a sort of mixed use story around the retail? That's the first kind of qualifier. Can you give us comfort that there'll be other income streams that will kind of help us if, for whatever reason, retail doesn't turn out to work as it should? And I think the second qualifier is very much around that pricing and this idea that perhaps we haven't reached the bottom. Obviously, the investment market tends to lag a little bit what's happening on the ground. And there's a definite sense that there should be a sort of further price correction. And I think that is true for some parts of the UK, but not everything.
So Nicola, looking at the debt side of the equation here, you know, Rebecca sketched out this mixed use future for our town centres, and Shamik has said that, you know, we could and should be bringing beds into our town centres. M7 would suggest we should be bringing sheds into our town centres as well. But mixed use isn't that nice, clean underwrite for your credit committee, is it? So is that going to be more difficult to finance these mixed use investments, or even let's think about the developments we need to do? That's surely got to be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, look, it is. I mean, clearly it's an exciting opportunity that everybody sees that and the benefit to obviously sort of regeneration, and particularly looking at it from a sort of sustainable finance perspective, which is dear to our hearts and many others. But ultimately, we have to underwrite a transaction, and we have to be able to support transactions to a credit committee. And going back to when I sort of learnt the trade and how you underwrite real estate and real estate lending, it was all about cash flow, looking at the bricks and mortar. What are your operating costs? And I think not just COVID. I mean, trends were happening ahead of COVID, and COVID just accelerated the trends. But now cash flow is becoming a lot more operational, a lot more short term. Maybe linked more to turnover, maybe linked to sort of more sort of subscription type facilities. Whether it's flexible office space, tenants looking for flexibility from a retail perspective, and that's a really hard one to underwrite. We're in the world of a lot of structural change, and we don't know where that's ultimately going to end. so like, I think the key is really, the micro dynamics of what you're looking to finance, and how comfortable you can get and who the sponsor is and what the structure is. But it's certainly turned underwriting on its head, and is definitely, if you're looking at speculative development finance, something that's challenging for the lending community.
But in this dynamic world where flexibility is our friend, surely that's something we need to be embracing. And Bruce, you've seen this from an occupier point of view, where you want that flexibility, but you want to be able to invest. So how do you sort of reconcile this sort of push and pull between flexibility and at the same time trying to create some certainty for investors and bankers?
Yeah, of course, we're looking at the changes in our lease commitments, the rental models we use. But ultimately, we've been finding time and time again, even through the pandemic, where there's a clear relevant proposition, whether that's for brand partners and the occupiers, and helping them match their proposition to our guest needs, the visitors, the shoppers. We've seen each time in reopening a rebound, and of course we've all felt that real feel-good factor now that we've come out of the lockdown.
But at the end of the day, there are plenty of places that already embrace flexibility. Much shorter leases are commonplace in other geographies. And Rebecca, I'm sure you've got experience of that you could talk to. And again, Nicola, across EMEA, there aren't places that used to have 25-year leases. They're gone. So what's the problem with moving to this new model?
I mean, you're absolutely right. Shorter lease durations are far more prevalent on the continent. I think the challenge is when you're underwriting a transaction, you always want to look back through a cycle and look how an asset performed or an income profile performed, and look at tenant retention rates, churn, etc. And that just isn't, that hasn't happened. It hasn't been a feature of the UK market, and so we all have to embrace change. And I think it's not just now about tenant retention and churn. Real estate has become more of a service. So you're also looking at what do your occupiers want from that building. Landlords are no longer just owners of real estate. They have to look at working with tenants collaboratively, and adapt and be sort of more dynamic and working in partnership. I suppose it's just it's a newer concept in the UK, and we don't have that historical sort of data to help us frame any stress testing.
Shamik, Rebecca, how much of a problem is that for you when you sit and look across Europe as a place which you can invest in town centres and retail, this lack of data and transactional record in the UK?
I mean, for us, it's a huge problem here in the UK versus Europe, right? Out in Europe, yes, you have these shorter term leases, but you also have all this turnover information that allows you to take a view on whether income you're getting from the retailers is sustainable or not. And then secondly, the tenants often don't have security of tenure, meaning that come the end of the lease, even if it's short, you then have a proper grown-up conversation with the tenant saying, oh, you're either performing well, we want to keep you, let's continue on this journey, or you're not performing well, your turnovers have declined or aren't sufficient in terms of euros per square meter, please move on, and we'll bring somebody else in who does perform. And that sort of partnership is totally broken in the UK. There's asymmetry in information, and therefore asymmetry in incentive as well. And funnily enough, actually, Mark, we've spoken about this in the past, but we've looked at schemes where we think, okay, look, let's go and speak to all the retailers. So schemes that we want to buy, let's go and speak to all the retailers. Let's tell them we'll reset all your rents. We'll drop the lease lengths for everybody across the board to 2 or 3 years, but no security of tenure. You have to share all your turnover information, and we can kick you out if your turnovers decline by 20, 30%, whatever, right? Let's set a threshold. And the feedback from retailers, sorry, we're not interested. We don't mind keeping the current structure, but just drop our rents by 30, 40%, So, it's the same problem. So it continues these asymmetries.
So Bruce, are you clearly speaking the language of the occupier? You are trying to sort of square this circle off a bit. So how are you getting on in the precious 4 months you've had
Yeah, well, this would, typically I arrived in a business where having voids is a threat, the challenges around rates and the reform needed there. But I see the voids as an opportunity to refresh offer, and very much agree there with the comments that to get away from where we've seen challenges and failures where the offer became homogenous and stale, and using data to drive a dynamic offer. This is the way forward. And keeping that freshness and newness. We want to bring newness to entice shoppers out and get them to return again and again, as well as the existing brands need to deliver great experiences and help really keep up with the shifting attitudes and behaviors of the consumers and the shoppers. This is the challenge, and it's always been such in the evolution of retail that we've seen over, we heard earlier talking about 50 years ago and the changes, and looking forward. This is a constant dynamic, which this challenge and crisis we've all been living through is presenting great opportunities to refresh and regrow and rebuild and invest.
Rebecca, any thoughts on that before we move on from pure retail, perhaps?
No, I agree. And I think, as I'm listening to the rest of the panel, I sort of think we all agree that we are there, we exist, both landlords and occupiers, to cater to the end consumer. But in reality, we all operate under this sort of framework of the Landlord and Tenant Act, and it creates this sort of very, I don't know, it creates apathy between the two of us, and it's not a good place to start. So, to Shamik's point, yes, when we look at new opportunities to invest in, and there's that lack of clarity and visibility as to what type of return we could get if we were to rebase everything and just do base and turnover rents. I mean, part of that is, of course, the tenants don't want to tell us that information because they're afraid that if it comes to a 5-year rent review, we would put them in a very difficult position, and therefore they wouldn't be able to operate that store properly and profitably. So I think, we have a lot of work to do as landlords. I think we need to accept that we need to provide them far more data. We need to be more transparent around our own objectives and what we want to, take away from these assets. What returns are we seeking? And in turn, I think they will open up a bit more. But that impasse needs to be solved before anything else can happen.
Absolutely. And I think we can all agree that whilst more retail is not the answer to any high street or any town centre, retail will still form a vibrant core of most of our places. I think that there's some nodding on the panel, so I think we're in agreement there. Absolutely. But I think much like town centres, you probably need to move the conversation slightly on from retail and onto the levelling up agenda and this £1.2 billion funding gap, or maybe the £250 million investment opportunity in our town centres. And it occurs to me, because I'm old enough, that as we came out of the last major recession, there were businesses such as Land Securities and Chelsfield who are absolute heroes of regeneration in places that I'll presume you wouldn't possibly invest at the moment. Am I mistaken? I mean, Rebecca, you're jetting around the world and going to Shanghai and the Champs-Elysees, Great Yarmouth on a wet Thursday is not a place we're going to find anybody from Chelsfield. So where's this new regeneration going to come from, and how do we get Landsec sort of back to the this great national champion that they once were?
So it's sort of $1 million question. I mean, I'll answer, and perhaps Bruce will add to my comments. I don't think that we wouldn't invest in town centres again. We have looked at some recently, and I certainly don't think that the answer to life is putting, just more retail into them, to your point, Mark. But I do think there's a huge dichotomy between what is investable today and the time frame that you would need to invest in to see some returns, and the reality of a lot of these investors, to points made earlier on, that are just not prepared to sit on a business plan for 10 years plus. And the reality, of course, is that is how long it will take, and in some instances it will take longer to see regeneration come through and to see return. So for us, when we look at opportunities, we go, oh yeah, this would be great, but if realistically, if we were to exit at the 7th or 8th year, it's just not going to make enough returns for us to seriously consider it.
Before going back to Bruce, can I bring Shamik in on that? Because obviously, you do run these private equity funds, which are by their very nature term based. So is it, you know, regeneration per se, is that something you have to sit out of, or are there ways you can play the market or play dislocation?
I think there are, I would say probably hundreds of examples where private equity can play a part. You know, I would say two things. That firstly, perhaps cities or towns and local authorities therein don't quite view it in the same way, but they're in competition versus each other. Not every city or town is going to win the fight, right? And the sooner you get on with it, the more likely the chance you are of being successful. And I think, you know, Lord Kerslake talked about maybe decay since 2010. I would say it's actually many high streets have been decaying for the last 30 years. You know, it's not something really recent. And to reverse that will be another 30-year type program. So I think local authorities have a huge part to play. And then private equity will come in short-term kind of windows to provide funding where needed, but it will have to be some asymmetric sharing of risk with a local authority.
That's really interesting. Maybe we can come back to that. So Bruce, your new employers, they've got this long-term patient capital being a REIT. Where do you think you're going to be deploying that capital, and what do you think is going to excite your board in terms of the regeneration world?
We've actually identified a couple of key locations in Greater London where we're looking at the mixed-use urban developments and working with the local authorities on that long-term vision. Of course, in the meantime, we have to optimize space and make our spaces work and be relevant. But we see across the board outside of London as well, in places like Leeds, in Glasgow, Cardiff, where there will be a need to repurpose some space, where there is some surplus in terms of space optimization as we work on what sustainable rents look like. But ultimately, at the heart of it is what we see as the community needs, and finding that balance of sustainable business and the environmental challenge that we're all facing into, right? There's no escaping that as well. So we want to be ahead of the curve there in carbon emissions and getting to net zero. So, you know, taking all of these needs, it is a long journey, as Shamik just said. These are 5, 10, 15-year horizon projects we're working on, while in the short term, we make the most of the spaces we work in today.
And everybody is talking about these long-term investable cash flows, which, you know, there's this glut of savings in the world that's looking for them. I mean, what's the attitude that banks in generally have, and the regulatory sort of regime for lending longer term, Nicola? Is there a disconnect between what you can lend and what the market needs for this type of thing?
I mean, longer term, if you look at longer term capital, debt capital, it's typically come from the alternative lenders. You know, I think clearly looking at sustainable finance, it's something that we are very dear to. You know, we've got a global ambition to facilitate $750 billion to $1 trillion of sustainable finance and investment by 2030. So it's clearly a big statement there. And, you know, it's something we're trying to put a lot of thought leadership to. We've got Professor Greg Clark, who's the head of our future cities. So it's something we're looking at, but still we have credit committees to answer to, and you have to look at the risk spectrum. And we're looking at a risk spectrum, then you have to look at a whole different sources of funding, and that ranges, you know, with that be the banks or more entrepreneurial cash institutions or alternative lenders. And I think it will just depend on the level of risk. You know, we've talked about a whole different spectrum, and obviously key is very much sponsor and sponsor support. You know, being you know, having long-term relationships with clients that you've invested with or lent to for many years, and have the right sort of leadership to be able to drive forward these sort of, whether it be new cities, new towns. So I think it's really hard to say, sort of give any sort of specific answer, because I think the opportunity is so vast, and it will require a whole multitude of different types of investors and different types of financiers for any sort of given situation.
Absolutely, and maybe we need a new type of capital formation, which we can talk about, or government encouragement. But yourself and Bruce and Shamik both mentioned sustainability. And, you know, it strikes me at the end of the day, there is nothing more sustainable than investing right at the heart of communities. From a transport point of view, that's where all the transport nodes go to. From a reuse of building point of view, the amount of carbon in existing buildings we're going to have to work out how to use. You know, this is, hopefully this is, you know, two crises coming together to find a better way forward. We've had the COVID crisis, which has made 10 years of change happen in little over 10 months. We've got the climate change crisis rapidly approaching. It's happening now. And surely the answer, we could tie the answers together. So what I'm trying to get to is a point where there's a little bit of reluctance to invest in some of our town centres. Maybe this sustainability agenda will move it back up the agenda. Am I deluded? Am I trying a bit too hard to look for investment there?
I think you're right, Mark. In the economies of scale logic of a concentration of people doing different things, that logic is aligned with the sustainable agenda, right? So you're absolutely right that we've put in hundreds of years worth of investment to create these cities and towns, and now's as good a time as any to try and make use of that investment and not have to recreate that in an unsustainable way. I think, you know, but just one additional comment in terms of regeneration of high streets. You know, the fragmented ownership is a problem, right? And when we talk about mixed use, it doesn't necessarily have to be that every single building has got multiple asset classes within it, which would make it difficult from a credit perspective, obviously from an equity sponsorship, as well as from a legal perspective. But, you know, taking a town center and dividing it up into various uses, that makes a lot of sense. But then you have the problem of the fragmented ownership. Who takes what, and how do you divvy up the economic value? And that is something that can only be solved with local or central government help.
And that's fantastic. And Rebecca, how do you see the sustainability agenda affecting or hopefully boosting our investment in our town, cities and high streets?
I completely agree. I mean, it's a sort of killing two birds with one stone situation where everything points to us being able to embrace kind of the town centre as a sustainable way of regenerating the country effectively. So in theory, this should absolutely work. I will say that the big qualifier is public sector support and, you know, the ability for us to go to them and say, well, you know, this is what we're thinking of doing. You know, to Shamik's point, going as a group, you know, be it a public-private bid, to see a local council and saying, this is, you know, this is our vision for a centre. These are some of the ESG policies that we want to put into it, integrate into our master plan. Can this be delivered? Can you help us? Are they going to be, you know, tax rebates or whatever it might be to help us deliver it? Because otherwise, we will not be able to magically just make money out of this if all we're doing is creating beautifully sustainable town centres and ploughing money into it and possibly just never seeing a return. So it's, to me, it's very much a partnership, and as Shamik said, public sector has a lot to do here for us and with us.
Yeah. Absolutely. Bruce?
Well, you know, and this is the key thing, the partnership that you mentioned there. I don't refer to our tenants as occupiers. We talk about brand partners, and when we're talking together about upscaling into a now empty Debenhams location, we're also trying to discuss what we can do, not just to make shopper experience better, but if we need to build a beehive on top of that old department store and add some electric charge points at the car parking entrance for your click and collect and delivery area. You know, these are things we want to do together with our brand partners and work together on building this better place that serves that community. And I think it is in partnership, whether it's from the investment point of view, from a retailer's point of view, or a property owner, and then with local authorities, as we heard earlier today from Lord Kerslake. This is how we can make a formula that wins. And keeping in touch with people, hearing direct feedback, that's something we're really interested in. We want to know what people are thinking, whether it's social media chatter, and getting momentum behind this, because it's as we also heard about the children that are the future of today. we want to build, what is there for young people to look forward to today, other than growing up and going to the pub? We want to build those places where they can thrive and communities can thrive.
So just before we move off from this, so we're hearing a lot from Lord Kerslake about the government, both national and local, being the prime and the first mover, and that's something I'm picking up from you guys as well. You want to see this movement happen on a local level, whether it's site assembly for Shamik or what have you. But you know, we do have a number of local government leaders listening in today. What advice would you give to them to make their places more investable? I mean, Rebecca touched upon it, but let's be explicit. Let's have a shopping list. What's best practice look like for local government to get investment from the mighty Morgan Stanley or Chelsfield or Landsec?
Well, look, I mean, for me, there are, I guess, case studies when you look at Rotterdam or Gothenburg or Lyon. You know, the first thing is that the local authority needs resources and needs authority, right? Which they perhaps don't currently have the entirety of. They have to share it with central government. So, you know, that's a wider problem, right? Local authorities need the ability to drive change and not have to go back to central government every single time. Secondly, you need a framework that, I guess I like to think of it as long-term vision, but short-term action. You know, life changes, right? You can't set a vision for the next 30 years and expect for that to be the right vision for that 30-year period. So have the necessary processes and tools at the local authority level that enable the long-term vision, but also allow for regular commercial input along the way as well. And then, like I'll give you an example, actually, maybe best exemplified. We own a shopping center in a town in the north, and we went to a local authority. We said, look, here's the vision, not just for our shopping center, but for the wider town center. It will involve some of our investment, it'll involve some of your investment, it'll involve site assembly through whatever shape and form, whatever structure we can come up with. We can use the Spanish model, where you create essentially common ownership and everyone chips in, or we can get the local authority to CPO, right? And we said, because there's obviously a bit of paranoia, and understandably based on past experience, that private money's there to try and kind of, you know, make extraordinary profits. And we said, we will cap our returns, right? So that you know that we're not making a ridiculous profit from all this. And I thought that this was going to work, and local authority, you know, local elections coming up, and they said, look, let's talk about it next year. You know, so how do you get around the election cycle and create these long-term setup with that as a problem? I don't know either, right? But you know.
Yes, election cycles do cause short-termism, which is a problem we have locally and nationally. And thank you for that great worked example, which answers off some of the questions that we've got in the sidebar. So Esther Boys, hopefully that answers your question quite nicely. Rebecca, what do you want to see from a place that gets you excited about bringing your expertise to bear?
I mean, so it's been said before, obviously a business rates reform and an online sales tax of some sort, or a levy that brings money back into the high street. I think the planning reform is a really good starting point, but it's only just a starting point. I was speaking to some colleagues in New York a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying to get an outside seating license takes 24 hours. It does not take 24 hours in the UK, at least in my sort of very limited London experience, right? And I think we need to get to a place where the planners also move with us, and to Shamik's point, it moves with the market, because we can't possibly have a planning framework and then local councils saying, well, this might work, this might not work, and that is set in stone for 5 years. And every time you want to change something in any asset, you have to come to us for A, B, C, or D. That it delays the process, and it doesn't allow the high street to thrive, in my opinion. So for me, the biggest change we need to see is planning, setting aside business rates, obviously.
And I think the planning white paper is fairly ambitious in its aspirations. And sorry, Bruce, did you want to come on?
I think that's just an interesting question here around creating long-term value, and it's as Oliver asked, and thinking about ways for new, innovative, and more localized tenants that can pay the same rents as those majors in the future. I think this is something I've been challenging my asset management and leasing teams, that we want to take some of these failed spaces that where businesses have recently gone into admin and had to close, which is always a shame. But we also wanted to find a way to counterbalance that by creating incubator space. So we're looking at flexible retail units that will allow people that don't even have a retail concept, that haven't had the capacity maybe to invest and develop something, so that they can have a route to market and get their products and their services even in front of shoppers that are maybe coming for some of those bigger household names that are there today. I think this is, again, an example of where maybe in the past models of a certain way of charging rent and having occupier costs, that we can think differently to create that opportunity to help people grow the business, whether it's in leisure, F&B, or other forms of retail. And I think this, we need to find those solutions, be creative, and get the support both from local authorities to help us achieve that, the government when we think about reforms that need to be made to help facilitate that, where maybe the old successes have changed and the way of working has changed. As Shamik said, in the last 30 years, has been dramatically changing.
Nobody passionately believes in that more than me, and there's lots of nodding around the panel. But obviously, vitality's hard to value, and if you can't value, you can't lend on it, Nicola. I mean, there is a bit of a problem here, isn't there?
Yeah, and like actually, we look to to the sponsors and the people we're backing, to sort of help frame that journey. And yeah, valuation. If you look at Rick's Red Book valuation, that's what we typically lend off. That's what we're required to lend off, and that doesn't have a section there for what you just described. So that's what we'll be looking to.
I mean, lending to local authority credit, is that something as a bank you've got any experience of? I mean, is that a thing? Is that a developing market that might happen? Because the government doesn't seem keen to be lending ML through Public Work Loan Board. So is there a market opportunity there for a global bank?
Look, I think it's something I haven't been involved with, so wouldn't like to sort of comment on any specifics. But I think things where where you may have local authorities that own real estate, as an example, and look to monetize it. There are ways of working together. I don't have personal experience, but certainly there has to be an opportunity for landowners, whoever they may be.
Bruce, have you actually got out on the road and met some of the local authorities where Landsec have been sort of long-term embedded, and what have you learned from the experience?
Yeah. Actually, just this week I was in Cardiff, and one of the local planning authority members was explaining to me some of their vision to open up a canal reaching down to the bay, and of course that's right across where our shopping centre is there. So we're always in touch to understand both our context in the local community and the role we can play in that. So whether that's from the importance of employment and job creation, right, which is an obvious benefit to the local community, but also in having that, as Shamik said, the vision for the future of the urban planning. And this is where we really need that joined up thinking, because sure, we have some great real estate in our portfolio, but it's still a small percentage of the overall picture. So we want to do our part, but we need to work more in unison in our sector and across the board. I think this is a way we can really shape things. So having that vision, though, is a starting point, really.
Vision, leadership, these are words that keep coming back, not to haunt us, but it's clearly a rallying call that we want to see in local leadership to make things happen. I do have a slightly privileged position in my role with the High Street Task Force of interfacing with MHCLG and government ministers. So if there was an ask that I could take back to the High Street Minister when I track him down, what are the panel looking for to make this a more, and we have touched upon things, a more pro-investment world, so that we can start funding this regeneration that the government needs, and we can find this £1.2 billion funding gap? Who wants to go? We've mentioned business rates. I mean, just let's spend a little bit of time on this. Just how alien does business rates appear to people who are used to not investing in the UK?
Completely and utterly. You know, we don't have it in Asia, we don't have it in continental Europe, we certainly don't have it in the US, and it's the number one obstacle to getting both investors to understand the opportunity, but also occupiers to understand trading potential. Because, you know, an occupier may come from, well, wherever, Netherlands, and they will have a business plan, and suddenly, you know, they're having to account for another third of occupational cost on top of what they've already modeled. You know, no matter how good our sales densities historically have been in the UK, it doesn't match up to, you know, some of the margins and some of the profitability of stores that they may have in other parts of the world. So it's huge, and it needs to change. You know, if anything, it's putting more pressure, never mind big occupiers, it's putting more pressure on smaller occupiers too. And, you know, we're on this panel sitting here talking about thriving high streets in the future. I mean, my God, independent store owners don't stand a chance. They really don't stand a chance here.
I couldn't agree more. I think this crisis has caused rents to fall. It could lead to a blossoming of entrepreneurialism and independent retailers that everybody seems to be craving. But when you've got a situation where the business rates might be a multiple of the fair rent, something's broken. And I hasten to add that taxation is a Treasury matter, and I don't get to speak to anybody at Treasury. Bruce, does it really affect an occupier that much when you're looking to take space that the UK is so dysfunctional in that respect?
As you said, having lived in both Asia and continent most of the last 20 years, coming back to the UK, that was one of the biggest shocks for me, seeing the negative impact on the high street. And I think it's forced let's say brands and small independents as well as larger businesses to make tough decisions they wouldn't have wanted to make in a different light. And likewise, let's say landlords have probably also had to make decisions they wouldn't normally make just to get around legislation and try and mitigate the impacts financially these voids and would have. So I think the time the crisis throws this up again to say we really need to join in a dialogue. And I think this is one of the areas I've seen as a retailer and now in the property sector, it's where we have common ground to really go back to the table and say, how can we find a better solution together, and what can we do? Because something has to change. It's the impact, I think, is going to be as we go through this year and we reemerge and we all want to rebuild. This is a barrier that's holding us back.
Shamik, you talked about transparency and data, and you know, I'm a bit of an idiot savant in that I understand the UK market, but I have no knowledge of foreign markets. So when you're looking at an opportunity to invest in a town centre in another jurisdiction, what sort of data would you normally expect?
Well, look, I mean, the key thing that I mentioned earlier is turnover information, the retailer tenant turnover information. Because that then gives you a true picture of how they're performing. Can they afford the rent? How have they been performing historically? Therefore, allowing you to forecast how they will perform in the future as well. So that's the key piece. And just one quick comment on business rates. I mean, you know, most countries in the world have some form of taxation on property, and the two key variables tend to be, how is that calculated? Is it on value, or is it on, you know, in the case of the UK, the rentable value, the rateable value, and then who pays it? Is it the landlord or the tenant? I obviously see all the issues that UK business rates cause. But for example, if you did revaluations every 3 months, if that was possible through technology, then maybe it wouldn't be such a problem anymore, and the principle of the business rates would be fine. You know, or you could have problems like you have in the US, where property taxes tend to be very, very high. That also causes all sorts of skewed behavior as well. I mean, there's no, if you want to tax property, which makes sense from a central government perspective, because, you know, historically it was the thing that would be registered, so it's easy to get at, then it's always going to cause asymmetries in behavior. But, you know, like I'm not such a fan of an online tax. I don't know why you'd want to pick on a particular industry that's actually flourishing. You know, you can think about corporate income tax rates. You can think about transfer pricing. You can think about, you know,
doesn't that go
overall? You can think about revaluations on a more regular basis, because obviously industrial rents have been going up and up, where retail rents have been coming down.
Isn't there a sustainability case for an online tax to capture the externalities of delivery vans clogging up the roads around?
You know, with combustible engines from until 2030, having electric access points, having incentives for electric. It'd be a very strange indirect way of getting to that, having this online tax.
Fantastic. Well, there's no doubt that the high streets, every nationality has a high street of sorts or has town centres, and you know, COVID has probably adversely affected all jurisdictions, and retail probably isn't the flavour of the month anywhere globally at the moment, we might say, but there are places that are probably doing better than we are, undoubtedly. So as a sort of closing thought from the panel, it'd be good to hear from you about some examples of places that are getting it better, and places that, if I have a budget and I don't, that I could get on a plane, or to be more sustainable, maybe get on a train or a boat to go and visit, to go and learn from best practice about how to make our town centres better. It'd be great to hear from the panel as a sort of closing and positive thought of some places that work. Bruce, we kick off with you with your international globetrotting view as a brand partner.
Well, you know, I learned to admire even the Italians. That they refused a lot of change around them, and the piazza culture that still thrives today. They sort of, almost by not doing anything, the world's come round to their way of thinking. And I found that a lot of the town centres where I lived in Italy and travelled around Italy in particular, because I think a lot of the challenges we face today actually make us look back. We should look backwards even at ourselves in time, and get back to some of the things that maybe we've taken for granted in this rush to globalization in the last couple of decades. Of course, you know, as a retailer, I greatly admire some of the things I've seen in places like Singapore, where they've really, you know, been able to create a template that we can all look at of how to make a safe place and that's sustainable and thrives. But I do think we've had a great history in this island as a nation of shopkeepers. I think if we actually look back to some of how we behaved in the past, we might find some of the answers right there.
Fantastic. Nicola, is there a jurisdiction or a place that sails through credit relatively easily when you're doing a new underwrite?
Look, probably not, because you have to look at the fundamentals. Yeah, so again, it comes down to how the real estate works and the cash flow. I say just one just interesting thing, we haven't touched on it as much, and I know time's short, but I suppose one thing to bring out is probably digitisation, and how we're going to be using real estate going forward. So whether that's from a sort of retail perspective or how we're going to use our town centres. If we're all potentially, you've got digitisation and urbanisation, if we're going to be more local communities, maybe go into big cities less frequently with working from home, or having more mobility in terms of how we operate. One key thing is getting the digital infrastructure right. And so actually it was just coming back to a point where you said about what we would be looking for, just from a sort of consumer perspective, is having digitization and being able to be pretty much online anywhere within your community.
Yeah.
Shamik, so where are you going to be getting on a plane when we're allowed to deploy some of your billions?
Well, no. Look, I mean, I'm not so sure about that, but I can give you examples. Like in Madrid, there are parts of Madrid that I'm a big fan of, or part of Rotterdam, where the planning system and the local authority, central authority, and private funding have come together to revitalize huge swathes of land. So I think, I don't know if we're going to invest there, but certainly I like these case studies.
Well, being a great place to be, I think, is the start of all regeneration and all investment at the end of the day.
Yeah, anywhere sunny, in conclusion.
Well, it's sunny in London at the moment, but it's also blooming freezing. Rebecca, finally with you.
I would probably have to pick somewhere home, so I'd probably say either Bilbao or Valencia in Spain. I'm a big fan of regeneration that starts with culture at the heart, and I think some of the initiatives that local councils have taken in both Bilbao and Valencia to create new neighbourhoods and to allow neighbourhoods surrounding those kind of regenerated neighbourhoods to evolve and become something else has been really interesting to watch, and it has happened, in my view, quite organically over the space of maybe a decade or two.
Yeah,
fantastic. They're great places which are easy to visit as well, so maybe I will try.
If you have the budget to go further afield, I was made aware when I met with some of the people from Farfetch and Browns, there was a project in Sao Paulo, Matarazzo, I think it was called, where they took an old abandoned part of the city and were making it both a digital and green space with art, culture, and shopping and eating, all at the heart of it. It was a very exciting project they were developing. So in Sao Paulo, there to regenerate an old abandoned part of the city. So I think there are projects out there globally that show a light on a way to work in the future that combines this physical and digital and environmental credentials while still inspiring us.
And to be fair, in the UK, I mean, there are some fantastic examples that I see in my role at Taskforce coming through. And I think it's, there's not many good things happened of the time of COVID, but the fact that the Future High Street Fund was put in place in 2018 and the process of bidding was over the last 12 months means that there are some shovel-ready schemes that are going to start happening in the UK, which I think are going to provide some real exemplars and some real leadership to those local leaders where people can look to and go, well, we don't have to go to Sao Paulo, we don't have to go to Bilbao, though I would love to go to Bilbao. We can go to Stockton and look what they've done there about demolishing one of their shopping centres to open up a vista down to the River Tees, which is now a great place to actually do your leisure activities. So I think hopefully it's not going to be too long before we've actually got some international exemplars and international examples, which not only can we be proud of and shout about, but we can hopefully raise a bit of capital to do some more across the UK as well. So David, if you're lurking in the background there, I think we're just through our...
I am lurking.
You're lurking, good man, as always. Well, look, before I hand over to you, look, thank you, panel. It's been absolutely fantastic. It's delivered everything I wanted. It's been hugely interesting and entertaining. And thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you to Rebecca, Shamik, Bruce, Nicola, Mark, and of course, Mark. I mean, just a quick overview, and I've made loads of notes. That's really very, very helpful and really gave us an insight overall. And if we take in Lord Kerslake, what he said and what James said about some of the challenges at a strategic level. And I think we all get this, don't we? The importance of the town and city centres, the high street, as we call them collectively, the importance of levelling up and that disparity in the UK. So there's an urgent need to do this, but I think you all made the point. The retail world has changed and the relationship between landlord and the retailer has got to change. And it's interesting, you picked up on that reluctance that it's a sort of two-way street, which I find a little bit fascinating. We need more data, more transparency, a new model, more aligned to market. Totally agree with that. And values need to adjust. And this point came up again, and it's come up a few times in other things we've done about the challenges of fragmented ownership on the one hand, and the importance on the other that the public sector takes real leadership and supports, particularly around sustainability and also at a planning level. And that bit about the political problem of short-termism, which it must be from a sort of patient capital, long-term investment point of view, a real barrier, as you pointed out. So long-term agreements are a challenge, but we need them. And planning needs to be a lot more dynamic and business rates. I mean, interestingly, I did something some years ago with John Lewis, and Andy Street in his day stood up and talked about the overall cost of running a retail group and, business rates. It's all part of occupational costs, isn't it? And we are totally out of sync. It needs radical reform. And finally, this bit about, vision and leadership at a local level is absolutely critical. And I sort of thinking about this business rates position and the sales tax. I'm not sure about that, but there are people cleverer than I am. Perhaps I need to buy some brain supplements. Who knows? Anyway, listen, thank you to all. It's been a great session. And Mark's told us that when we get back to eating in the warm, he's going to buy us all the best lunch we've ever had. So thank you for that, Mark. Yeah, thank you all for joining us. Thanks to the High Streets Task Force. Thank you to Leslie Jones and James Cons. Our next event's coming up on May the 12th, Beyond MMC, where we've got a stellar panel. On May the 20th, we've got a keynote with Tony Travers, who's going to talk about, if you like, the heritage and history of development in London, which is going to be fascinating. On May the 27th, we've got a major webinar on delivering major regeneration views from the front line. Another stellar panel there. So thank you for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you got value out of the session. I hope you're going away better informed. We'll keep you posted on our upcoming events, but in the meantime, have a wonderful day. Thank you very much indeed.